is the CBS 4 U.S. Senate Democratic Primary Debate with our partners, the Colorado Sun and PBS 12.
Thanks for joining us. I'm CBS 4 political specialist Sean Boyd. We're going to spend the next hour questioning Colorado's two Democratic Senate contenders, former Governor John Hickenlooper and former Speaker of the State House Andrew Romanoff. Thank you both for joining us via Zoom to maintain social distancing. Also joining us from their offices are election partners, political reporter John Frank with the Colorado Sun and Dominic Dezzutti, host of Colorado Inside Out on PBS 12. There is unrest and unease in the country right now. The death of George Floyd has enraged people and resulted in an uprising. Protests, curfews, looting, National Guard troops being deployed, all this against the backdrop of a pandemic that has killed tens of thousands of people and cost millions of jobs. This race could determine which party controls the U.S. Senate and how our nation responds to both of these historic moments in time. For this debate, you will generally have 60 seconds for your answers. Let's begin. If you're elected, you will have an opportunity to address systemic racism in areas like education, employment, and housing. What specific legislation would you introduce? Mr. Hickenlooper?
Well, I think it's worth revisiting that the pandemic created a moment where when the shooting of George Floyd took place, everyone was in their living room, everyone saw it, and it was a catalyst to action. And so in terms of specific legislation, it's got to be comprehensive and it can't be anything in isolation. So to address education, let's once and for all make sure that equal education is a basic right and make sure that third grade literacy is a big part of every kid's education. Make sure that we have apprenticeships and skills-based training for the kids who don't want to go to college, and free on a sliding scale for those who need it, community college education. The healthcare, we saw the inequity in healthcare that COVID-19 laid bare. Pre-existing conditions, but also the lack of facilities close to where people are. And then last, I think it's housing has forever been a real challenge for so many people of color in this country. And I think it's now once and for all the time in a comprehensive effort to make sure that we have fair housing practices that can be enforced. And first apply more resources, tax credits, more waivers, but make sure that every single person in this country can have housing that they believe they can trust in.
Thank you. Mr. Romanoff, specific legislation to address systemic racism.
Well, it doesn't do us much good to pass civil rights laws if we don't actually enforce them. I designed and supervised an undercover investigation of employment discrimination for a state civil rights agency. And I want to use the resources of the federal government to root out racial injustice in every form. I would sponsor legislation in the U.S. Senate to address discrimination in employment, housing, banking, lending, education, and healthcare. I would use the resources of the Justice Department to make sure that terrorist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and neo-Nazi groups no longer continue to prey on communities of color across the United States. I joined the Southern Poverty Law Center when I turned 21 to fight the Ku Klux Klan and neo-Nazis. I did not expect to be having the same fight 30 years later, or to find a president of the United States on the other side. This nation needs not only to replace Donald Trump, but also to remedy centuries of oppression. And that means we ought to provide reparations for the victims, not only of discrimination against the African-American population, but also against indigenous peoples too.
Thank you. You are two white men of privilege competing to represent a diverse state. Give us an example of a time when you could have done more or better in leading the fight against racism. Mr. Romanoff?
You bet. I think it's plain that none of us has done enough. And I take responsibility there too, because you're right, Sean. As a white man in this country, my own privilege has enabled me to achieve everything I've ever done. Those advantages are not available to every American. I wish we had taken more action in the state legislature, the House I led, to address police violence, because George Floyd's murder is not an isolated incident. I've laid out a plan to address the horror of police brutality, a comprehensive plan you can find at andrewromanoff.com. I also recognize that going back to normal is not good enough. Incremental reform will not solve the crises we face. We need instead bold structural changes in every walk of life. And I hope when I get to the US Senate, I'll be able to build the same kind of coalition I achieved in the State House, where I led the Democrats to our first majority in 30 years to address these issues. But I'll be perfectly clear. It's not enough simply to flip the Senate from red to blue, although that's important. We need to change the chamber itself from paralysis to progress. And that's exactly what I intend to do.
Thank you. Mr. Hickenlooper, do you regret your handling as Denver's mayor of any brutality complaints against police?
Well, certainly it's the moment I saw the video of George Floyd and his murder, I was taken back to 2 weeks after I was about to get it, 2 weeks before I was going to be inaugurated. And the day after the election, so 5 weeks before then, Mayor Wellington Webb, my predecessor, told me that his one regret was he hadn't pushed back hard enough against the police. And Paul Childs, 2 weeks before my inauguration, a 15-year-old African-American boy was shot in his front hall. And at the funeral, I met leaders of the Black Ministerial Alliance, and we forged a partnership and really created some of the most meaningful reform for police up till that time in the country. Office of the Independent Monitor with subpoena powers, a Civilian Oversight Commission, minority hiring. But looking back, we didn't go far enough. We needed to go beyond that. And as you look at what we're doing now in police departments all over the country, we could have done more of that in Denver as well. Certainly, when you look at President Trump and what he's doing to fan these fires, it makes it all the harder for people to get these things done.
Thank you. We've all seen the recent protests, and we wanted to hear from those young voices. So our next questions are from Nate Smith and Ayanna French.
But I need to understand, why should my young people vote for you? Me, myself speaking, we are all tired.
When we say that Black Lives Matter, do you guys truly try to grasp and understand what that means?
Mr. Hickenlooper, you want to address them?
Yes, and thanks, Nate. I hear you loud and clear. And for too long, the opportunity, and by opportunity I mean educational opportunity, healthcare opportunity, housing opportunity, job opportunity, has been unequal. And we've worked hard, but when you haven't delivered, it becomes painfully evident. My commitment has always been, my son Teddy is 17, and he was on the march on Sunday, and I went out to the protest myself. And this is that moment where young people like yourselves are able to stand up and make meaningful that demand that once and for all, let's address this systemic racism that we've allowed to pervade our country. This racism is it has gone on so long, and yet this has to be the time where the entire country comes together and we address it. And when I go to the Senate, I'll be an agent of change. That's what we did in Colorado. That's what I want to do in the Senate, build those coalitions.
Thank you. Mr. Romanoff, could you address Ayanna and Nate's questions?
Yes, and I want to say thanks to Ayanna and Nate for presenting this challenge squarely before us. Look, it does us very little good to say Black Lives Matter if every single day we act as if they don't. There's an old saying, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And when it comes to representing communities of color, it's not enough simply to show up when you need a vote or when the ballots arrive, as they are this week. You've got to be there every single day, and better yet, make sure that young people and people of color have positions of power. That's not happening in America right now. I've tried throughout my career as the minority leader in the House, as the Speaker of the House, as the President of Mental Health Colorado, and in the positions I mentioned earlier in the field of civil rights, to make sure I surrounded myself with people who brought different experiences and different perspectives. I didn't start this campaign with the assumption I've got the answer to every problem, but I do bring to this race a deep sense of urgency and a recognition that the pain driving these protests is rooted in centuries of oppression. We shouldn't just ask how we got here, without recognizing we've always been here. From a nation before its founding that enslaved African people, that subjected African Americans to segregation, discrimination, Jim Crow laws, lynching, and murder. We cannot declare victory at this point, and we should not be able to take any comfort in the progress we've made until we make good on the promise of equal justice for all.
Thank you. Do you think that most police officers are racially biased and we need sweeping reform? And what is the most important police reform that's needed? Mr. Romanoff?
I think the most important thing we could do is to shift resources from our police departments to other community services. That's the thrust of this movement right now, and it's long overdue because racial bias in law enforcement dates back to the origins of these departments themselves and to police efforts. So while I've laid out a plan that would end chokeholds and strangleholds, require body cameras and more accountability, including independent oversight bodies, while I certainly support efforts to recruit and train and hire officers who reflect and respect the communities they serve, all of those efforts are important, but they don't go far enough. As long as we continue to treat incarceration as the solution to these problems and incarcerate more African Americans than their percentage in the population allows, as long as we allow Black people themselves to be killed by police officers 2.5 times as often as white people, we're not in a place of equality and justice.
Thank you. Mr. Hickenlooper?
Yes, and this gets back to what Nate and Ayanna were talking about. We do send far too many young people, kids of color, to jail. And there's a movement also called Reimagining Justice that the program is the focus, and we're beginning this in Colorado, that rather than ever sending a teenager to jail, we have diversionary programs and educational programs, skills-based training to make sure that we need smaller jails and we send less kids to jail. And again, it's predominantly kids of color. Let's change that. When we legalized marijuana, that became a moment where suddenly we were going to be able to make jails smaller, and we're doing that. We have a program on my website that's called Equity for All, and it does lay out how all of these efforts and initiatives can come together in a comprehensive program.
Thank you.
I think it's
Thank you. Some are calling for defunding police departments or at least reducing funding. If you agree, where should that money be redirected? Mr. Hickenlooper, and if you could keep your answer to about 45 seconds here.
Sure. And what I was just talking about, this notion of reimagining justice, allows us to put resources not towards arresting or chasing criminals, but really focusing on how do we make sure that less people go to jail and that they have better choices and opportunities. One of the things we did while I was governor was really focus on making sure every prisoner from one of our state prisons, when they're released, they've had training and they've had the opportunity to learn skills and get ready for the outside world and hopefully have a job waiting for them wherever possible.
Thank you.
Making sure that we can use our resources as efficiently as possible, whether we're talking about any agency, but especially the police, it should be our highest priority.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Romanoff.
One place we've shortchanged is mental health care. I led the fight for the prevention and treatment of mental health and substance use disorders for the last 4 years. And I'll tell you, Sean, I had a conversation with a sheriff who told me he runs the largest mental hospital in his community. It's called the county jail. That cannot be the right approach. Turning our jails and prisons into warehouses for people who face mental illness or drug or alcohol addiction is literally the most expensive and least therapeutic decision we could make. So I'd like to reinvest in mental health care in America. We've cut those programs throughout the country and use the resources that we're spending now on criminalizing these illnesses instead to prevent and treat them. What we're talking about here are priorities around public health.
Okay, thank you. We're going to shift gears now and give our panelists a chance to question each of you individually. We're going to start with John Frank of the Colorado Sun and questions for Mr. Hickenlooper.
Thank you, Sean. For this series of questions, you'll have 60 seconds to answer, Mr. Hickenlooper. And let's start here. A week ago, you defied a court order and subpoena to appear before the State Ethics Commission. The commission held you in contempt. Why do you think you are above the law?
Well, first, I appreciate the chance to talk about this. And let's be very clear. These are trips I took while I was governor. I said I would go anywhere and everywhere to try and bring jobs and economic growth to the state. There was a dark money Republican group that made 97 allegations against that travel. And the commission got it down to, they focused on two. One was a conference I attended. I paid my own airfare. I paid for the hotel. I was led to believe that the hotel included all conference costs, but the commission felt that was otherwise. The other was for the commissioning of the USS Colorado, where I went with a group of people who were helping finance the ceremony and the support for the USS Colorado. The military is a big part of our economy. It was an important event. That also the commission had found fault with. I accept responsibility for this, but we should remember that this is a dark money attack group, a Republican dark money group that was going to smear my reputation no matter what, and they're going to smear any Democrat no matter what, because Cory Gardner can't run on his record. He's been a yes man for Donald Trump from beginning to end, and he's never been that independent voice for Colorado as he promised.
But Governor, can you answer the question? Can you tell me why you defied the subpoena and why you felt like you were above the law?
Certainly no one is above the law, and I never for a moment would say that anybody should be above the law. We had appealed the subpoena because I thought my due process rights, and my lawyer supported this, that would be better served if I could appear in person. And I've been asking to appear in person for almost a year. And that the subpoena came, we felt in another few weeks, I would have been able to appear in front of the commission. And it's a very different system as we are now when you're on a Zoom, is more restricted and doesn't give you the same opportunities to communicate people. And certainly you don't have your lawyer in the room with you. You don't actually see the faces of the people that are questioning you. We filed an appeal, and when they came back and said, well, you can't appeal, you're in contempt, we came back and said, all right, we will come in tomorrow morning if that's your decision. We respect this commission. And while governor, I helped increase the funding for the Independent Ethics Commission by almost 25%. We came back and testified the next morning.
Thank you, Governor. And for those keeping score at home, the complaint included 12 formal allegations, not 97. 2 were deemed violations, and 1 more remains unresolved. Let's stick with the topic for one more quick question here. In the ethics case, the state paid your attorney's fees. Given that you ignored the initial subpoena, should you reimburse taxpayers for the legal fees?
As I said, these were trips where I was going on behalf of the state of Colorado to try and bring jobs and economic development back to Colorado. And I did. I paid everything I could. I mean, I paid everything I was told I should pay on the one trip. And on the second trip, I really believed that we were really supporting Colorado by being there for the commissioning of the USS Colorado. I take responsibility for the commission, for what the commission decided. But I do want to keep saying that this is a dark money Republican group, just a smear tactic. They're going to attack any Democrat who runs against Cory Gardner because there's no real way that Cory Gardner can run on his record. He's been tearing down the EPA or supporting Trump appointees who are tearing down the EPA. He wants to repeal the Affordable Care Act and take away the protections for 2.4 million Coloradans.
Let's get back to the question. Will you take accountability for the legal fees? Do you feel an obligation to pay them back since you ignored the subpoena?
I feel that our efforts to go out and really bring jobs back and
okay, Governor, let's move on. We've heard you discuss that. I'd like to move on to a new topic. A year ago, you said you didn't want to run for U.S. Senate and said, quote, "I am not cut out to be a senator," end quote. Now you say you are committed to the campaign. Which Hickenlooper should voters believe, and why did you change your mind?
Well, I make no bones about the fact that I criticize the Senate as a broken institution, a place where good ideas go to die. But at a certain point, you have to decide whether you're going to sit in the cheap seats and be a critic, or if you're going to step into the ring and really try to make a difference. And I looked at what I did in Colorado to bring people together and actually create change, create methane regulations and get all the mayors in Metro Denver to create fast tracks. These are the kinds of things, the kinds of collaborative efforts, what I call the Colorado way, that need to go to Washington. And I got more and more excited about it. I believe I have the skills to go back to Washington, bring people together, get things done. And I decided to step out of the cheap seats of the critic and into the ring, just like thousands and really millions of people are stepping into the fight now. And I want to be one of the forces of change to go to Washington and once more make the Senate the conscience of our Congress and our country, and once more make the U.S. Senate a place where things get done. People work together, find collaborative solutions, and are able to build themselves up or build up their ideas and their programs so that they'll actually have meaningful effect. I am more fired up and more excited about this campaign than any campaign in my past life.
Mr. Hickenlooper, a quick follow-up here, just 30 seconds should do the trick. The Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, the National Party, endorsed your campaign and snubbed the campaigns of numerous women and minority candidates who were in this race. Do you think that was fair?
Again, I think that our role here is to make sure that we defeat Cory Gardner, and the voters of Colorado are going to decide who the best candidate is. I don't think the DSCC plays that large a role in that determination. My sense and my full belief is that I have a unique set of experiences as a CEO, as a mayor, as a governor. I understand how those branches of government work with business and small business and how they should work with the federal government. I wanted to make sure that we were able to go to Washington, that I can go to Washington and actually bring people together who don't necessarily like each other and finally begin getting things done, change the way the Senate functions.
Mr. Hickenlooper, let's move to one final topic here. As governor, you worked closely with the oil and gas industry. You even drank fracking fluid at one point to prove it was safe. Do you regret that move? And do you still support fracking?
I believe that climate change is the greatest existential threat that faces the world or ever has faced the world. And I have for almost 40 years worked aggressively to address it. We need to get to a net zero carbon emissions program by 2050 at the absolute latest. And a lot of what Colorado has done is a good foundation for what has to happen in the U.S. Senate. And while Donald Trump and his appointees that Cory Gardner supported are ripping apart the EPA, our protections for clean air and clean water, we've got to have a detailed program in the Senate where we get rid of coal-fired electrical plants. We have transitions to electric vehicles. We get all fugitive emissions like methane, and we take advantage of the innovations in industry and agriculture to create a clean jobs economy that will help this entire country.
Thank you. All right, we want to keep this
Mr.
moving, so
Hickenlooper.
thank you both. We're going to keep this moving and go to Dominic Dezzutti from PBS 12 and Mr. Romanoff.
Sean, thank you very much. Mr. Romanoff, thank you for your time. For these questions, we will ask a 60-second answer, please. My first question is, you have supported and wholeheartedly supported the Green New Deal from the very beginning of your campaign. Do any of the tens of thousands of Coloradans that work in the oil and gas industry have any reason to look past that support and vote for you?
You bet. And I've been meeting with many of those workers. Part of the Green New Deal, and this is key, includes support for the people you're describing. I don't want anyone to be treated as collateral damage. So what we ought to do instead is assure the fossil fuel workers the training and education and skills and support they need to take jobs in the clean energy economy. I know some folks on the other side of this debate will tell you you have to pick between a strong economy and a healthy environment. That's false. We can do both. Thanks in part to the leadership of Governor Hickenlooper's successor, Jared Polis, we're making progress on that front. And the good news is we have twice as many jobs in clean energy, including energy efficiency, as we do in fossil fuels. One last point real quick, Dominic. The folks you're describing have kids as well and families. They need to breathe clean air and deserve the right to drink clean water. So when you've seen under the previous administration runaway oil and gas development and a record deterioration in air quality and an increase in birth defects, especially in and near the fracking zone, you have to ask, whose interest was John Hickenlooper representing? The fossil fuel companies that fund his campaign or the people of Colorado? My loyalty is clear. I don't take money from the fossil fuel industry. I'll owe this seat to the folks who send me there, the folks who live in this state.
Mr. Romanoff, you have openly supported the most progressive aspects of the Democratic platform. In a state like Colorado that is very purple, with independent voters outranking Democrats and Republicans, why are you not too liberal for a state like Colorado?
If you look at every single one of the priorities we've laid out, I think you'll find broad support among the majority of Coloradans. And I'll just give you an example. I spent the last 4 years fighting the insurance industry on behalf of families like mine who have faced mental health or substance use disorders. Most Coloradans understand that a system bankrupting the United States, sending 500,000 families into bankruptcy each year, and leaving 72 million Americans uninsured or underinsured isn't working very well. I know Cory Gardner and John Hickenlooper both parrot the insurance industry in their opposition to Medicare for all. But this is a time for bold leadership, not for timidity. I think going back to normal in this broken health insurance model would be a disaster, especially when as many as 43 million more Americans may lose their employer-based coverage before we hit rock bottom. That's an agenda, this progressive agenda in support of healthcare for all that most Coloradans embrace. And I'm eager to lead the charge.
Mr. Romanoff, you offer a great segue into my next question. By my count, your support for Medicare for All, the Green New Deal, reparations, all this on the tails of trillions of dollars spent on the stimulus. What is your plan to pay for all of these enormous propositions?
Well, we're paying enormous amounts right now, Dominic, and it's a fair question. I'll just give you one example. I've suggested we ought to stop paying for pollution. We're spending in direct and indirect subsidies $650 billion a year on oil and gas and coal. I'd rather put that money into renewable energy like solar and wind. We need to transform our electrical grid, our building codes, our transportation system. We can put millions of Americans back to work building a clean energy infrastructure. We've got to take a page, in other words, from the original New Deal and create, instead of a civilian conservation corps, let's call it a climate conservation corps. So that's one place where we can save money, to say nothing of the expenses that we're incurring now as storms and floods and droughts and heat waves and wildfires become even more frequent and more destructive. But the only way to stop the subsidies that we're providing to the fossil fuel industry is also to stop the fossil fuel industry from subsidizing Congress. I hope Mr. Hickenlooper will join me in finally signing the No Fossil Fuel Money pledge, and perhaps in returning the hundreds of thousands of dollars he's taken from oil and gas companies throughout his career.
Mr. Romanoff, a short answer on this one, 30 seconds if you would. Colorado is full of people who experience and enjoy a balanced state budget, and it's just the opposite in Washington. Is there a place for actual savings and actually reducing the federal deficit with you as a senator?
You bet, and I'll mention a couple. One, we ought to put the Pentagon, the military budget, under scrutiny instead of allowing what Dwight Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex to bloat that budget. I recognize we face real threats to our national security, but I also recognize we're spending more on national defense than the next half dozen countries combined. Another place where we're spending too much money, in my view, is healthcare. We're spending, as Americans, about $11,000 per person per year. Our competitors in other parts of the industrialized world are spending closer to $5,000 or $6,000 per year. It'd be one thing if we could afford to spend twice as much, but we can't. Or if we were getting health outcomes that were twice as good, but we're not. So we need to take on the insurance industry and the drug companies, reduce healthcare costs, expand coverage, improve quality, and lower the costs that are burdening families and small businesses throughout America.
All right, I want to jump in here.
Thank you, Mr. Romanoff. Sean?
And yes, and thank you both there. Now we want to give you a chance to question each other. You each have 30 seconds to ask a question. Your opponent has 90 seconds to answer. Mr. Romanoff, your question.
I just posed a question to John, and I'll repeat it. Why not join me right now on this broadcast in signing the No Fossil Fuel Money pledge? I know you took the pledge and you scratched your name off the pledge when somebody explained to you what it meant. I won't even ask you to return the hundreds of thousands of dollars you've taken from the fossil fuel industry. I think it is worth asking what those companies get from you in return. But why not make history today? You and I can be the first two candidates, at least in Colorado's history, to refuse contributions from the oil and gas industry. Let's do that now. Will you join me?
Well, Andrew, you're mischaracterizing, as always. I've never taken a dollar from the oil and gas company for one of my campaigns. Our campaign is committed to no PAC money of any kind, and certainly no PAC money from the oil and gas industry. So my focus, we've had 100,000 or 110,000 individual contributions, and I'm sure some of them maybe work for an oil and gas company. But again, I'll reiterate, we have taken no corporate PAC money from anybody and no corporate oil and gas money.
Will you refund the super PAC money that came from an oil and gas company during your presidential campaign?
Okay.
If you can't refund it, will you renounce it?
We had time for one question. I want to move to Mr. Hickenlooper. Your turn to ask a question.
Well, Andrew, you spent a lot of time criticizing my record. I was going to ask you if you could rank, in terms of which ones you regret the most, your support for the invasion of Iraq, your support as Speaker for the 2006 bills that were so anti-immigrant and anti-Latino, and then in 2014 when you ran for Congress and ran on an anti-budget, balanced budget amendment. Which of those three do you like the best and which do you like the worst?
Your handlers in Washington are doing a good job on opposition research. The truth is, I made a mistake in 2006, and I'll acknowledge that. We, as you know, because you congratulated me after we passed this legislation, we put a statutory compromise on the desk of Bill Owens in order to stop a much worse constitutional amendment from taking place. That was a mistake. I own it. And I'm proud in the course of this campaign to have built a broad coalition of Latino advocates, to have made outreach to communities of color, and unlike you, to have actually shown up and debated these issues. I'm glad you're here now, John, but the truth is you have skipped 21 candidate forums to date. And the truth is we need a senator who will show up and answer questions. It should not take a subpoena to compel you to appear.
All right, thank you. I want to turn now to the coronavirus pandemic. We are starting to run out of time, so I would like you to keep these answers to 45 seconds. 70% of people say they don't want to return to work until there is more testing and tracing. How would you make that happen, and who should pay for that? Mr. Romanoff?
Look, I think that's essential. We ought to have been making much more progress in not only testing and tracing, but isolation and treatment, and we need to accelerate the development of a vaccine. To me, at least, the spectacle of watching healthcare workers in America, the heroes we're asking to defend us and keep us safe, beg for gowns and gloves and masks and other protective equipment is indefensible. So I think this has to be a combination of state and federal efforts. And then when we emerge from this pandemic, we've got to get to a place of Medicare for all, because it's pretty clear one lesson we can draw from this tragedy is that my health depends on your health, that we're interconnected. So when you leave 28 million Americans uninsured, or 44 million underinsured, or 500,000 bankrupted by medical bills, you make our entire nation's health poorer.
So government should pay. Mr. Hickenlooper, what do you think?
Well, I want to point out first that the depth of this pandemic is the result of President Trump and so many Republican senators like Cory Gardner either poo-pooing the importance of it or the risk, or turning a blind eye to the inaction of the president in the White House. We have allowed to see our public health infrastructure broken down in the White House. They reduced funding for the CDC, which Cory Gardner supported. You know, while I was governor, we added 400,000 people to Medicaid rolls. We got to almost universal health care coverage. But I think we need a public option to make sure that, as President Obama designed it, we get to universal coverage. Andrew really wants to repeal what Obama did. I want to finally finish it. And to get to that universal coverage, but then to make sure that there are clinics and access for health care to everyone, and that just as President Trump did not set up the supply chains for protective equipment or for testing or isolation, we've got to do that now, so that when small businesses start trying to reopen, they can know that their workers are safe and healthy, and that their customers can come in without fear.
So government should pay for these tests and tracing.
I'm not going to let John Hickenlooper mischaracterize my position here. I support Medicare for all. I recognize that the insurance industry and the drug companies oppose that plan. I recognize you are stuck on the status quo, but we need to break with a system that is bankrupting Americans.
All right, we're going to keep this thing moving. If there is a second wave of COVID, do you think the economy should be shut down again? If not, how do you protect public health? Mr. Hickenlooper?
Well, if there is a second wave of COVID, that is the same size or larger than the first will have to have some level of shutdown. But a big part of where we didn't react properly was we didn't have the capacity for testing, for universal testing. So we couldn't find out if someone had a sneeze. We didn't know if they were infected or not. And we didn't have any system for tracing if someone was found to be positive for coronavirus. We didn't have a way of finding out who else they'd talked to. If we get those systems in place, like some of the other countries in Europe and Asia have done, then we can look at actually not having to do a complete shutdown. But it depends on having supply chains that deliver enough testing, and it's got to be fast, and it's got to be free to businesses and citizens alike. And we've got to make sure that we also have the protective equipment to force small businesses to open or stay open where they can't provide that guarantee to their customers they'll be safe. It's a recipe for disaster.
Okay. Mr. Romanoff, do we shut down the economy again?
I hope we won't get to that point. Clearly, if you have millions of Americans dying, as the worst estimates suggested we might, you can't have a strong economy. Second, it does no good to say healthcare is a right if you treat it as an option and stick with a failed for-profit insurance model. Third, we ought to make outbreaks less likely by tackling the climate crisis, because the truth is warmer temperatures are driving the spread of disease-carrying species across the globe. So we need somebody to replace Cory Gardner who's actually committed to bold climate action. There's a connection, in other words, between our health, our environment, and the survival of life on Earth. Those are the stakes in this debate.
Thank you. House Democrats passed a $3 trillion stimulus, and it includes another round of checks. Do you support sending money to people whose pay has not been impacted by the virus? And what about people who aren't citizens but pay taxes? Mr. Romanoff?
I do, and it seems to me the benefits ought to go to Americans who are struggling and suffering under this crisis, not simply to those at the top. Well, I want to make a broader point here, Sean, if I may. The truth is, when you want an economy that works for everyone, the only way to get there is to build a government that works for everyone. And what we've seen too often are some of the nation's most powerful corporate interests and wealthiest individuals bankrolling Congress and blocking reform on every front. It's why the playing field is tilted against us. I've talked to small business owners who said, I tried to get a loan from the Paycheck Protection Program, but all the money was gone because the biggest banks doled out the advantages to their biggest customers. That's not fair. It's un-American.
Mr. Hickenlooper?
I think the problem with the bills that have been coming out of Congress to fight back from the ravages of the pandemic have been ridiculously imbalanced and skewed towards the largest corporations, the wealthiest individuals. That if you look at when the LA Lakers, some of the luxury hotels, you look at who's gotten the money. The key to this country's economy, the soul of America, are small businesses. And if you look at the U.S. Senate right now, there are only 5 or 6 people that have ever been in small business, actually made a payroll or lay awake at night worrying about it. We've got to make sure that they have a voice, and that when you have a stimulus package, it looks after the truly small businesses, the businesses that employ not just less than 500 people, but less than 100 people, less than 50 people, 5 or 6 people, the coffee houses, the hair salons. Those are the ones where our community comes together and activates, but they're also a huge part of our economic activity. We need to support them.
Thank you. Congress increased the amount people get for unemployment. It's more than many made working. Should the government pay people more than minimum wage not to work, and for how long? Mr. Hickenlooper?
Well, it doesn't make perfect sense. I understand the reasons for it, but it doesn't make perfect sense that we should be paying people more than they were making while they're working. It's not generally a good idea to provide incentives for people not to work. That being said, you have to recognize that the working people of America, the middle class and the working people of America, have been beset and ravaged by this pandemic more than the rest of the country put together. And the challenges they face, being able to put food on the table, being able to make their rent, we've got to be very sensitive to what they're living through. And that's a big part of why I want to get small businesses back in business, because that is dramatically where you look at the greatest suffering. And it's the hospitality industry, it's the outdoor recreation industry. Many of the industries that are a big part of Colorado's economy need that special small business support.
Right, Mr. Romanoff, paying people more not to work, and for how long?
We should have been increasing the minimum wage before now. It hasn't kept up with inflation. I support a plan that would raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour and then index it to inflation so it maintains its purchasing power. The reason we're in this mess is not because low-income communities are somehow scamming the government. It's because those at the top are getting away with robbery. In some cases, even avoiding paying not just their fair share, but any taxes at all. This is a moment that we're going to look back on in American history. And we're going to ask whether we met the moment with bold, creative leadership, whether we created a massive economic recovery plan on the scale of this downturn, or whether we settled for incremental reform. You got a choice in this race, I think, between timidity and leadership, and adding another Herbert Hoover to the Senate, or a Hoover-looper, is not going to do the trick. So I want to make sure that we give ordinary Americans a fair shot at the American dream.
But doesn't this disincentivize people to go back to work if you're paying them more to sit home?
I don't know anybody in America who says, gosh, because I'm now making $10 an hour instead of $9 an hour, I'm not going to want to be back at work. People understand the value of work. They just want to earn enough to support their families and pay their bills. And they can't do that now, in part because of the policies that John's opposed, like an end to paid sick leave, a proposition that he opposed when he was.
Wait. That's ridiculous. And I'll intercede this one time.
I'll let you answer this since he brought it up.
To make sure that that everyone watching realizes that I've supported increasing the minimum wage. I have supported child care for every working parent. I've supported increasing, maybe doubling the earned income tax credit. That's all got to be part of what we do to redrive this, or regenerate this economy.
I think he was referring to the ballot measure that you opposed. I want to move on. The U.S. Treasury has already had to borrow $3 trillion for stimulus packages. Are you concerned about the deficit, Mr. Romanoff?
I am, and I'll tell you, the best way to reduce the deficit is to put more people back to work. I mentioned earlier the New Deal, because you saw there an American president help lift the nation from a Great Depression and employ millions of people, building America again. We can do that now. But when other candidates describe those plans as socialism, or as Hickenlooper said, the discredited ideas of Karl Marx and Joseph Stalin, it's pretty clear we're not going to get the revenue we need from the jobs program this moment requires. So I'm excited about the opportunity both to combat this economic downturn and the pandemic that helped produce it, and at the same time to fight the climate crisis so that outbreaks like this one become even less likely and people actually get jobs building a clean energy infrastructure. That's the heart of the Green New Deal.
Mr. Hickenlooper, the deficit?
Well, certainly one has to look at the deficit, although the low cost of money from the Fed helps modify that. But I think we have to go back and look at all the tax breaks and tax cuts that Donald Trump has given to the wealthiest individuals and the largest corporations. And then we have to revitalize the economy in ways that go beyond what Andrew's been talking about. We have the ability with a green economy to create all kinds of not just new jobs, but new professions. And we'll create far more jobs than we ever lose in that transition from the old energy economy to the new one. But there's a whole universe of other jobs out there as well that we just need to make sure that we have the training so that people get the skills and have the opportunity to participate and take advantage of these every year new professions and all the new jobs that come with those new professions.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Now let's get back to our panelists, starting with John Frank of the Colorado Sun. He has questions for both of you this time.
Yes, and for this segment, we're going to keep answers short, no more than 30 seconds here. The first question. Please tell voters where you differ on policy from the presumptive Democratic presidential nominee, Joe Biden. Mr. Romanoff, we will start with you.
I support Medicare for all. Mr. Biden has agreed to lower the age of Medicare eligibility to 60. I'd like to lower it to 0. And look, the same attacks you hear from Cory Gardner and John Hickenlooper when they denounce this plan as socialism, that's the same rhetoric you heard against Medicare itself and Medicaid and Social Security. President Truman proposed national health insurance. He got attacked as a socialist. It does us no good to solve this problem if we simply parrot the talking points of the Republican Party.
Thank you, Mr. Hickenlooper.
I support most of the basic goals that Vice President Biden is proposing. We've gone farther in terms of the answers to racial injustice, and we have an Equity for All platform on our website. We think we can get more jobs out of the transition into a new energy economy. Not huge amounts, but significant amounts. And I also think that the manipulation or the how do you work out the actual transition into a new economic system, I might be accused of wanting to go faster than Vice President Biden does.
Thank you, Mr. Hickenlooper. We'll come back to you first for this question. Do you believe Tara Reade's allegations against Joe Biden, and will you still support him?
Well, first let me say that any woman who comes forward and talks about the sexual assault that they've had to endure, they deserve to be listened to and they deserve to be believed. And I look at Tara Reade as someone who showed a great deal of courage to come forward and talk about what happened to her. It's standard that you go through a process of vetting and examination of these types of allegations, and this is certainly a very complicated case. In the end, I still support Joe Biden for president, absolutely.
Real quick, yes or no, do you believe her allegations? Do you believe Tara Reade?
I believe
yes or no?
When she's telling the story. I beg pardon?
Yes or no? Do you believe her allegations?
To a large extent, yes.
Very good. Mr. Romanoff, the question to you.
I believe her allegations should be investigated and taken seriously, like any allegations. I don't know whether they're true or not. I support, at this point, Vice President Biden over Donald Trump. I will say, if the allegations are proven true, I would request the Democratic Party pick a new nominee.
Very good. And next question. Mr. Romanoff, as Senator, what Senate committee assignments would you seek and why?
I'd like to replace Senator Gardner on two committees where he sits now. You might say the seat is vacant already. One is on the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, because I'd like to have a hand in leading the fight against the climate crisis. The other committee I'd seek is on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, because it's pretty clear to me this president has done so much damage to our international alliances, withdrawing not just from the Paris Accord, but other agreements, emboldening tyrants, confusing our friends, coddling dictators. We have a lot of work to do to repair international peace.
Thank you. Mr. Hickenlooper, the same question to you.
So obviously the energy and natural resources, if we're going to take climate change seriously, that's where the real action is going to be. The Finance Committee has a large responsibility for the allocation of resources. It is the driving force behind any government. And then last, I've spent a huge amount of time while I was governor working on apprenticeship programs and skills-based training programs, and they should be national. We should have 1 million apprenticeships every year. And I think that would be a place that really it takes place in labor even more than it does in education. So those three different committees would be my first picks.
Thank you. Sean, back to you.
Thanks, John. Now to PBS 12's Dominic Dezzutti.
Thank you, Sean. Gentlemen, these be for both of you. Mr. Hickenlooper, we'll start with you first in this question. Cory Gardner was an underdog in 2014, but he ran an effective campaign against an opponent who ran a one-issue campaign. The script might sound familiar in 2020. Why are you the better opponent for Cory Gardner, better than your current primary opponent? Mr. Hickenlooper, we'll start with you.
Well, certainly as governor, I had to deal with so much of what Cory Gardner was letting happen. And he is becoming a yes man after promising to be an independent voice for Colorado. Became a yes man for Donald Trump. And as we've eviscerated the EPA, generations of appropriate, well thought out regulations. If you look at what's happened to our healthcare system, Cory Gardner wants to repeal the Affordable Care Act and would eliminate the protections for pre-existing conditions that are protections for 2.4 million Coloradans. And those problems are billboard ready. And I have the experience of not only having dealt with their attempt to sell off and sell to the highest bidder public lands and cut back the EPA regulations. But also I ran statewide. I keep saying in 2010 and 2014, very tough years for Democrats anywhere. I won statewide races and then came through real challenges, natural disasters and a great recession. And we showed that we could remake better than we were before again and again.
Mr. Romanoff, why are you better poised to beat Cory Gardner than your opponent?
I believe I had the best chance to beat Cory Gardner, in part because I have the most experience debating him. We spent 4 years together in the State House, in part because I won recognition as the most effective legislative leader in America, because I've earned endorsements now, not from Washington, but from 375 state and local officials all across Colorado. Look, I'll support John if he wins the nomination. I've made that clear all along. But when you break the law, defy a subpoena, when you become the first person ever held in contempt by the Independent Ethics Commission, when you tell everybody you'd be a terrible senator and don't want the job and aren't cut out for it, I think you make this task harder for yourself. And the truth is, John told everyone last year, we did not need him to beat Cory Gardner. He's right. We don't.
Cory Gardner is already running ads touting his international experience with Taiwan and South Korea. What international experience do you bring to this position if elected? Mr. Romanoff, we'll start with you.
Sure. When I left college, after I graduated, I moved to Central America. I took a job teaching English, in part in Nicaragua, in the wake of a very brutal civil war that our own government helped finance. That experience shaped my life. When I was out of office, I took a job for an international development organization, helping small-scale farmers in sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America increase their income. I also founded a collaborative center for international development, the first of its kind, right here in Denver. And I've traveled extensively throughout the world. It's one of the reasons I'm hoping to replace Cory Gardner on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. What we need in the U.S. Senate is someone willing to stand up to the President of the United States, even to their own party, when our conscience or our constituents or the Constitution demands it. I am ready and eager and willing to take on that challenge.
Mr. Hickenlooper, your international experience you would bring to this position if elected.
Well, I've spent a large part of my life, my adult life, in this hemisphere in Latin America. I worked for a year in Costa Rica when I was a graduate student in geology. I drove across Mexico, and I used that and other experiences to found and really help grow the Biennial of the Americas, which is like a think tank. It's a festival, a week-long festival every 2 years where we bring thought leaders, executives, university professors, elected officials from all over our hemisphere to Denver. And we really talk about what are the challenges we all face together in the entire hemisphere and how do we go beyond that. Obviously, while I was governor, we did economic development trips to multiple trips to Asia, to Europe, to try and build relationships and expand markets. If you look at the number of exports, the number of countries that imported our agricultural exports from Colorado, they increased dramatically in that 8-year period. And Donald Trump and Cory Gardner have allowed the tariff war to dramatically limit those exports.
All right. Dominic, thank you.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. Sean, back to you.
All right, now we're going to ask you both some quick questions. The goal is to keep your answers to 15 seconds. Are you a capitalist, Mr. Romanoff?
Yes.
Mr. Hickenlooper?
Yes.
Do you support a carbon tax, Mr. Hickenlooper?
I think we have to put a price on carbon.
Mr. Romanoff?
Yes.
Do you support abolishing ICE, Mr. Romanoff?
Yes.
Mr. Hickenlooper?
I think we have to dramatically reform it and recreate it.
Do you support reparations for African Americans and Native Americans, Mr. Hickenlooper?
Yes, I think we've got to make those investments into education and housing and healthcare that bring equality under the law and under life to all Coloradans.
Mr. Romanoff?
Yes.
Do you support a personal exemption for vaccinations, Mr. Romanoff?
I support a medical exemption. I don't think anybody should be forced to administer something that harms their health.
Mr. Hickenlooper?
I support a medical exemption, but not any other exemptions.
All right, I think that is all the time we have, and I want to thank you both for taking part in this most unusual debate. John and Dominic, thank you as well for your thoughtful questions. If you missed any of the debate, you'll be able to watch it on PBS 12 this Friday, the 12th at 9 p.m. You'll also find it at coloradosun.com, and we'll post it on our website, cbsdenver.com. Look for analysis as well. Finally, to you, our viewers, thank you for taking time to hear directly from the candidates as you prepare to cast your ballots in the Democratic Senate primary on June 30th. Look for continuing coverage of all the issues with Colorado Sun, PBS 12, CBS 4, and CBSN Denver.